So, have you ever wondered about the Olympic eventing substitutions, penalties, and how the scores are even determined for Olympic eventing? Well, this is going to be your one-stop shop to determine all of those things so that you know next time you're watching 3D eventing what you're looking for, especially when it comes to the Olympics or specifically team eventing, because there is very specific rules that are made for team eventing versus individual eventing, and we're going to go over both, and I'll be able to clarify which are for which. There's a couple of things I'm going to link to. The first thing is this is an article where all of the penalties and everything are written out as words, and you can, and I'm going to link to this article below so you can read through it in like a word version, but I also did something separate where I created this as more of a list view where we can just actually talk about what are the individual penalties and how and when they apply. So I will link to that article if you want to read about it, but also there's an easier way to look at this based on what we're talking about, what day we're talking about in 3D eventing. If you don't know what 3D eventing is, there's a link to a video here. Snoop Dogg started absolutely loving equestrian events, and so I wanted him to hop on the eventing bandwagon. Even though he's scared of horses, I think that he would love cross country. So I wanted to make this video for Snoop Dogg so that to invite him into the world of eventing, as the gymnasts say, Uncle Snoop. So if you want to find out more about 3D eventing specifically and what is awesome about 3D eventing, I would check out this video. But if you already know what eventing is and you want to just talk about what the heck is going on with the penalties and everything when it comes to eventing, then let's dive in. There's a difference between individual eventing and team eventing, and that's because when it comes to team eventing, they had to have a way for teams to compete and carry out throughout the 3 days without people getting, like, if somebody gets eliminated, then that doesn't completely, I mean, it does blow up the team, but it also doesn't make it so the team can't finish. So there's a bunch of so to start off with, there's a substitution penalty. So for instance, so there's day 1, day 2, day 3, so dressage, cross country, and stadium jumping. So let's say somebody does not finish any of those days. Well, you can substitute in one of your alternate riders, but you have to pay a couple penalties. One is a non-finish penalty, which depends on the day, and we'll go over that per each of the individual days. And then you also have to pay just a substitution penalty. So the fact that you have to substitute in a different horse and rider is part of the penalty as well. There is no penalty if you do a substitution 2 hours before dressage starts. So all teams have 4 people on them. You have the 3 competitors, and then you have your traveling alternate. Now, that traveling alternate is actually really important, especially when we start to break down how these penalties and substitutions work, because you could potentially be substituted in on the last day. So I found that really interesting, and we'll get into that when we get down into the cross-country penalties of it all. But first we're going to start with dressage. So for any of you out there that are wondering how dressage scores are determined, it is a percentage. It's a percentage of a total, basically. So when you're doing a dressage test, each individual move is out of 10 points, and then all of those potential 10 points are added to a total possible score. Now, of course, no one on the history of the planet has ever gotten 10s on all movements, which basically means that you would get ultimately a 0, which in eventing, lowest score wins. It's like golf. So what they do is they take the percentage, which in the percentage view, it's the highest percentage is the best, versus then they subtract it from 100, so then they want the lowest possible score. So an example of this is your total number of good marks. Let's say the total number of marks possible is 230. You average a 7, which means that you get 161 points out of the 230 possible, which means that when you divide that, you get 0.7, multiply that by 100, which means that you have 70, and then you take that 70, and the 70% is how like traditional dressage would look at that number. But eventing, what we do is we take the 100, like 100% minus the 70%, and then you get a score of 30. Now, this is where the lowest score wins, right? So in the Olympics, we saw records being broken in dressage where Laura Calais got a 17.5, which is the lowest dressage score in the history of eventing. Michael Young also got, I think he got a 17.8, and so those two are the new records. Previously, the record was held by Michael Young with like a 19.9. It was like a 19 point something though. So getting into the teens though is really, really hard. That is definitely not the norm. And even though I just rattled off a bunch of people who were able to do it, those are few and far between. I would say that in the teens is out of this, you knocked it out of the park, out of this world. In the 20s is you did amazing, like you did really, really well. And then in the 30s is you did it competently well, right? When you average a 7 means you did the move fairly well. So if you're averaging a 7, then that means that you are not only completing the movements, but you're completing them decently well. You're not blowing anybody's socks off. But a 30 is a decent score. There is a penalty though for not finishing dressage. So say you have a team of 3 and somebody doesn't finish dressage, then you get a 100-point penalty. I don't think that this penalty is used all that often, but of course you have to have it in the rule books in case the situation ever comes to be. I could see this as if you got eliminated for some sort of weird tack rule, or tell me in the comments if you can think of a reason why somebody wouldn't finish dressage. That's the only thing I can think of though, is somebody got in trouble for tack they weren't supposed to use or something along those lines, and then you would have the 100-point penalty for not finishing dressage, and then you would just start on cross country day. There's a couple of things with cross country. It's not about who goes the fastest, it's about who goes at the correct pace. So really it's about who gets the closest to the optimum time. Now, of course, with how fast the course is wheeled, meaning how fast you're supposed to go, ultimately it really just means you are going as fast as you can while being able to jump cleanly and safely. So because if you end up going too fast, then your horse can't read the question and stupid mistakes happen, or you're not able to make it over the fence the first time. So when it comes to cross country, you want to go at pace. You want to go over every fence the first time, and you want to make sure that you're jumping well, because there are different, as you can see down here, we have a flag penalty and we have a frangible penalty. So we'll go down the list and we'll get there. But it's with cross country, it used to be a really like get her done style riding, and now it's still get her done, but for certain types of fences, if you don't jump them well, then you incur other penalties that maybe weren't previously a problem, but they are now. So first refusal. So if you do if your horse refuses, meaning they don't jump it the first time, if you run past it, when it comes to fences that are numbered A and B, you cannot make a circle in between those two fences. You have to go straight from one to the other. So if for whatever reason you had to make some sort of circle in between an element that is marked with a letter, not only a number but a letter as well, meaning it would be like 11ABC or something like that. So if you had to make a circle between any of those lettered elements, then you're going to incur what's called a refusal, and it's a 20-point penalty. Now, if you have a second refusal at the same fence, then it gets bumped up to 40, and if you have a third refusal at the same fence, then you are eliminated. But if you also have a second refusal somewhere else, then that's just 20 more points. So every first refusal is 20 points, and then they get more costly as you go, and you cannot have more than 3 refusals across the entire course. Otherwise you get eliminated anyway. Now, I don't think very many people at the Olympic level get eliminated in this way. However, it is, relevant to know where the penalties are and what they really mean and why they happen. So I'm gonna skip down to the bottom where it's a team penalty for not finishing, and that's gonna relate up to if you have an athlete So when they say athlete or rider fall, athlete in this sense means horse. So if you have a horse fall, then the horse cannot continue to compete, and you would have to use your substitution. But if you have a situation where the rider falls but the horse doesn't fall, then you can take a penalty for just not finishing cross country, because you're not going to be able to get back on and keep going. But what you could do is so scenario A is the rider falls off and you take a 200-point penalty because the combination didn't finish cross country. Scenario B is, let's say the horse and the rider fall, which is always never fun, but it happens. So then the team would incur the 200 penalty points for that team member not finishing, and then you would also get a 20-point substitution penalty because you would bring in another horse and rider. Now, this happened at the Olympics, which I found really interesting, because what that ultimately means for that substitution rider is that they did not do dressage, they didn't do cross country, and they're just straight up going in and doing a stadium round for the team. And I found that really interesting because that would ultimately be riding a very different type of ride, like especially for a horse that's a 3-day eventer. So they are used to doing all this work before stadium. So you're just put in a fresh horse, and they're pretty darn fit, right? Like to do 3-day eventing, the horses have to be extremely fit. So that's I found that interesting because that's a very different ride. That's a very hard, difficult situation to be thrown into. But ultimately, that's kind of, if I was an alternate, that's what I would be preparing for. How to just go into a stadium round with the freshest horse on the planet. So there are, of course, time penalties because it's an optimum time. So it's 0.4 points per each second over optimum time. This, of course, just becomes a math problem based on how far over the optimum you are. Anybody crossing the finish line in the Olympics that jumped clean but has some time penalties should still feel really proud of the job that they did, because that is still amazing, right? So we have a couple other penalties. So the flag penalty. I also made a video about Ross Cantor's controversial flag penalty, if you want to watch that video. In that video, we talk about whether or not that is fair or competent or realistic, or if that is actually what should have been done in that scenario. The next one that is not up for debate is a frangible penalty. Now, this is a cross-country fence that falls down. Now, stadium jumping versus cross-country. Cross-country has always been solid fences, and that's why that's why even riders think eventers are crazy, because when you're jumping a solid object, there is little room for error. What a frangible penalty is there are now cross-country fences that fall down like stadium fences, and there's safety reasons and all kinds of other things why. But what they did is, when a frangible device is activated, meaning the fence falls down, you now incur an 11-point penalty. And this was the huge, I'm going to say controversy, but it wasn't really a controversy, it was just a big bummer, because Michael Young was winning in Tokyo and had a frangible, and so he didn't win because he had that frangible. There was also a situation with Tammy Smith where she was winning at Kentucky and she had a frangible and didn't win because of that frangible. So it is a situation where if you activate a frangible, you get penalized for it, and in those situations, it can cost you the win because it is 11 points, so it's pretty substantial. We already went over the team penalty for not finishing and a couple different scenarios in which those would apply. So, which brings us to stadium. Like I said, if you're in the scenario where you actually have a team member that didn't finish cross country and you sub somebody in, right? So this is like what happened to Team Germany. They had one horse and rider who had they had a freak accident on this one fence, which Team Germany unfortunately had a freak accident, and the horse did not fall down. The rider just fell off because of what the horse did. So they just incurred a 20-point or a 200-point penalty for not finishing, and that automatically takes you out of the running for a medal, unless everybody had that problem, which it wasn't the case, right? So bringing us into stadium. So a dropped rail and a refusal, we just went into that a little deeply because of my little rant about how we weighed all these penalties in the first place. But those are both 4, and it is interesting to note that if you jump, so there's verticals and oxers. So verticals have one pole and oxers have 2 poles. Something interesting that is, if you jump a vertical and drop a pole, that's 4. If you jump an oxer and drop both poles off the top, that's still only 4. It doesn't count against you per each rail you drop. It only counts against you if you drop a rail. Which I also find is something that if you really wanted to like punish people in terms of penalties, like that's an opportunity for you to do that. If that's really what, you know, the people who invented this sport, if that's really what you were after, like you want everybody to be penalized per each individual action, there's your opportunity there. Trying not to give people ideas. FEI, if you're watching this video, which I highly doubt you are, but if you are, it's debatable, guys. And then of course this is the same as cross country. If you, for every second you are over time, it is 0.4 of a penalty. It is a lot easier to make time in stadium than it is on cross country. And then you have your 100-point team penalty for not finishing stadium. So if for whatever reason you have a horse and rider combination so you have 3 people, right? So if you don't have 3 people competing on the last day, then you just take a 100-point penalty for not finishing. These are all of the Olympic team and individual eventing penalties. I don't know about you, but I found all of the substitutions and non-finishing penalties to be really interesting, and really does change, for me, the way that I think about if I were putting together a team for eventing, like how I would think about what is the most valuable aspects of a horse and rider combination. Because while I would say that a lot of people really value low dressage scores, I personally think that jumping clean and making time on cross country is a much more valuable asset than a dressage score. And I think if you can get a mid-30 dressage score and end on that dressage score, that is way more valuable than someone who gets in the 20s on dressage, but then has a lot of time on cross country, because you're basically going to end up at that 35 depending on how far over the time you are. So just interesting and strategy, and ultimately I don't expect any of you guys to just 100% agree with me, so please comment down below what you think about all these different penalties, which ones you think are more valuable than others, where you think that eventing should change or alter their plans. Of course, when it comes to this flag penalty, I made a whole video about that controversy. That's a whole thing. I hope this helped, and I found this deep dive very fascinating, but let me know what your thoughts below. So, and I'll see you on the next one.